Welcome back to Life Science Channel. Today, we're diving into one of history's most devastating pandemics, a plague so catastrophic that it helped bring down an empire, reshaped the medieval world, and yet remained largely forgotten until recent decades. This is the story of the Plague of Justinian. Picture this: Constantinople, 542 CE. The jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, a city of nearly 500,000 souls, the largest and wealthiest city in the Christian world. Markets overflow with silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt. The Hagia Sophia, barely 5 years old, dominates the skyline, an architectural marvel that still stands today. But something sinister is coming. Within months, this thriving metropolis will become a charnel house. Bodies will pile up faster than they can be buried. The death toll will be so staggering that Emperor Justinian himself will fall ill, throwing the empire into chaos. And this won't just be Constantinople's nightmare. It will spread across 3 continents, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people over 2 centuries of recurring waves. Today, we're going to explore how this pandemic started, how it spread, what it did to the human body, how society tried to cope, and how modern science finally identified the culprit using DNA from 1,500-year-old teeth. We'll also examine whether this plague really did change the course of history, or if scholars have overstated its impact. So, settle in. This is a story of rats and fleas, of mass graves and desperate prayers, of empire and collapse, and of a microscopic bacterium that for a time became one of the most powerful forces on Earth. To understand the plague of Justinian, we first need to understand the world it devastated. The year is 527 CE. The Western Roman Empire has already fallen. Rome itself was sacked decades ago, and barbarian kingdoms now rule most of Western Europe. But the Eastern Roman Empire, which we often call the Byzantine Empire, is alive and ambitious, and it has a new emperor, Justinian I. Justinian is a dreamer. He doesn't accept that the Roman Empire is finished. He envisions a restoration, reconquering the lost Western territories, reuniting the empire under one law, one faith, one ruler. And for a while, it actually works. By 540 CE, his general Belisarius has reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. Italy is being wrested from the Ostrogoths. Southern Spain will soon be back under imperial control. The dream of renovatio imperii, the renewal of the empire, seems within reach. Constantinople is booming. It's a truly global city. You might hear a dozen languages in a single market. The famous grain dole feeds hundreds of thousands. The hippodrome hosts chariot races that can spark political riots. The emperor is building churches, aqueducts, fortifications. This is a civilization at its height. But there's a problem with empires, especially maritime empires connected by trade routes. They're perfect incubators for pandemic disease. The Roman road system, the Mediterranean shipping lanes, the trade connections reaching all the way to China and India, these same networks that brought wealth and power would soon become highways for death. Grain ships from Egypt would become floating coffins. Merchant caravans would carry more than just goods. And somewhere in Central Africa, in the highlands of what's probably modern-day Uganda or Kenya, a bacterium was evolving. We know it as Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, and it was about to embark on one of the most destructive journeys in human history. The ecological conditions were perfect. Rodent populations in Africa had long harbored plague in what scientists call enzootic cycles, the disease circulating among animals without necessarily jumping to humans. But something changed. Maybe it was climate, maybe it was human activity expanding into new territories. Maybe it was just bad luck. Whatever the trigger, plague began its journey north and east, likely carried by rats on trading ships moving up the Nile, across to the Red Sea, and into the heart of the Roman trading network. The stage was set, the bacterium was on the move, and nobody saw it coming. Our best contemporary source is a historian named Procopius, who lived through the plague in Constantinople and left us a chilling eyewitness account. According to Procopius, the plague began in Pelusium, Egypt, in 541 CE. From there, it split, spreading both to Alexandria and eastward to Palestine. This makes perfect sense. Egypt was the breadbasket of Constantinople. Massive grain ships made regular runs from Alexandria to the capital, and these ships were teeming with rats. Imagine being a sailor on one of those grain ships. You're probably not alone in the hold. Rats are everywhere in ancient ships, and they're tolerated because, well, there's not much you can do about them. But on this voyage, you start noticing dead rats. Lots of them. Maybe you think nothing of it. Maybe you're even glad. But what you don't know is that when a rat dies of plague, its fleas abandon the corpse looking for a new host, and you're right there. The plague reached Constantinople in the spring of 542 CE. At first, it might have seemed like just another disease outbreak. Cities had epidemics periodically, but this was different. Procopius tells us that people would start with a sudden fever. It came to some in their sleep, by day, to others while awake, he writes. The victims would feel fine one moment and then struck down the next. Within a day or two, painful swellings would appear, in the groin, in the armpits, behind the ears. These swellings, called buboes, which is where we get the term bubonic plague, were the lymph nodes desperately trying to fight off the bacterial invasion. Let me get scientific for a moment about what was happening inside the body. Yersinia pestis is remarkably good at evading the immune system. When a flea infected with plague bites you, it literally vomits thousands of bacteria into your bloodstream. These bacteria make a beeline for your lymph nodes. The bacteria have a clever trick. They inject proteins directly into immune cells that basically shut down the cell's ability to call for backup or destroy the invaders. So your lymph nodes swell with bacteria and dead immune cells, creating those characteristic buboes. If untreated, the bacteria multiply to staggering numbers and spill into the bloodstream, causing septicemia. They can also reach the lungs, creating pneumonic plague, which is then airborne and can spread person to person. The mortality rate was horrific. Procopius suggests that at the peak, 10,000 people were dying daily in Constantinople. Modern scholars think this number is probably exaggerated, but even if it's half that, we're talking about apocalyptic death rates. And the symptoms were nightmare fuel. Some victims would fall into a coma and die peacefully, but others experienced delirium, hallucinations, paranoia. Some developed gangrene as the bacteria cut off blood flow to extremities. Fingers and toes would turn black and fall off. The pneumonic form caused victims to cough up blood. Procopius describes people walking around seemingly healthy, then suddenly dying while shopping in the marketplace or talking with neighbors. The randomness of it, the way it seemed to strike without pattern, terrified people perhaps more than anything. Medical knowledge at the time was based on the theory of humors, the idea that disease came from imbalances in bodily fluids. Doctors would bleed patients trying to rebalance their humors. They'd prescribe different foods, specific prayers, amulets. None of it worked. Plague doesn't care about your humoral balance. Some people tried quarantining themselves indoors, refusing to see anyone. Some fled to the countryside. Some threw themselves to prayer and repentance. And some just gave up, deciding to enjoy their final days with feasting and drinking. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague. For days the empire held its breath. If he died without a clear successor, civil war could erupt. But Justinian survived. He was one of the lucky ones. Many historians believe the plague changed him, made him more religious, more paranoid, more withdrawn. But let's talk about the death toll. The city struggled to bury its dead. All the normal procedures broke down. Procopius describes how initially people tried to bury their family members properly with Christian rites, but soon the cemeteries overflowed. Graves were dug but filled before they could be used. Justinian appointed a special official to deal with corpse disposal. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls. The towers of the fortifications at Psyche were filled with bodies, packed in tight and sealed. Ships were loaded with corpses and sent out to sea. The smell must have been unbearable. And Constantinople was just the beginning. the plague spread outward in every direction. Over the next 3 years, the plague swept through the Mediterranean world and beyond. Let's trace its path. From Constantinople, it moved westward into Greece and the Balkans. It reached Italy, where Justinian's armies were still fighting the Goths, and it devastated both sides. Procopius, who was with the army as a military secretary, tells us that the campaign ground to a halt as soldiers died by the thousands. It spread north into Gaul, what's now France. The historian Gregory of Tours, writing a few decades later, describes how the plague hit the city of Arles around 543, killing so many that the church could barely perform burial rites. It moved east through Syria and Mesopotamia, reaching Persia, Rome's great rival. The Sasanian Empire was hit just as hard. There are records of entire villages being abandoned in Mesopotamia. It went south through Egypt, following the Nile, devastating agricultural regions. This had catastrophic knock-on effects because Egypt's grain fed Constantinople. Crop production plummeted, not just because workers died, but because the survivors couldn't maintain the irrigation systems. North Africa, which Belisarius had just reconquered for the empire, was ravaged. Port cities were especially hard hit. And here's what's truly terrifying. This wasn't just a single wave. The plague kept coming back. Modern scholarship has identified about 18 to 20 distinct outbreaks over the next 2 centuries. The first wave, 541 to 544, was the worst, but there were major recurrences around 558, 573 to 74, 586 to 589, 599 to 600, and then continuing into the 600s and 700s with the final recorded outbreak around 750 CE. Each wave would kill a new generation that had grown up with no immunity. Parents who survived the first plague would watch their children die in the second. This created a psychological trauma that's hard for us to imagine, living with the knowledge that at any time the plague might return. Why did it keep recurring? This is where the ecology gets interesting. Plague can establish what's called an enzootic reservoir, persistent infection in rodent populations. As long as rats and other rodents remained infected in certain regions, the disease could periodically flare up and spread to humans. The trade networks of the Roman world meant that even if plague died out in one area, ships from infected regions could reintroduce it. It's similar to how we see disease outbreaks today. As long as there's a reservoir somewhere and travel between regions, eradication is nearly impossible. Some areas were hit worse than others. Urban centers, especially ports, suffered terribly. Rural areas with less contact might escape one wave only to be hit by the next. The unpredictability made it impossible to develop effective coping strategies. The geographical spread was enormous. Plague has been documented from the British Isles to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Atlantic coast to Persia, and possibly beyond. One text suggests it may have reached as far as Denmark. This was truly a pandemic in every sense of the word. And the cumulative death toll was staggering. Modern estimates vary wildly, from a low of around 15 million to a high of 100 million over the 2 centuries of recurrence. A middle estimate of 25 to 50 million is probably reasonable, though we'll never know for certain. To put that in context, the entire population of the Roman Empire and surrounding regions at the time was maybe 60 to 80 million. We're potentially talking about a mortality rate of 30 to 50% in affected regions. Some cities may have lost more than half their population. This wasn't a quick catastrophe. This was 2 centuries of recurring nightmare. Imagine living your entire life knowing that the plague could return at any time, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop it. Let's talk about what happens to a society when a third to half of the population dies. The immediate effects were obvious. labor shortage, economic disruption, administrative breakdown. But the long-term consequences reshaped the medieval world. First, agriculture. The Roman economy was based on intensive grain cultivation. Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, these were the breadbaskets. But grain agriculture requires a lot of labor for planting, irrigation maintenance, and harvest. When a huge percentage of agricultural workers died, production collapsed. Land that had been carefully cultivated for centuries was abandoned. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The tax base shrank dramatically because taxes were largely based on agricultural production. This created a vicious cycle. Less revenue meant the government couldn't maintain infrastructure, which meant more agricultural decline, which meant even less revenue. Justinian tried to compensate by raising tax rates on survivors, which only increased resentment and led to more land abandonment. Some farmers just gave up and fled to cities, hoping for charity or the grain dole, which itself was shrinking. Urban economies were devastated too. Crafts and trade depended on both producers and consumers. When both populations crash, markets collapse. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic decline in the volume of trade goods moving around the Mediterranean after 540. The army suffered terribly. Military recruiting became difficult because there were simply fewer young men available. Justinian's reconquest of the West, which had been going so well, stalled and never fully recovered. The empire lacked the manpower to garrison all its newly reconquered territories. This had huge historical consequences. The reconquest of Italy, which should have been consolidated, remained incomplete. Within decades, the Lombards invaded and took large parts of Italy. The empire's hold on Spain remained tenuous. North Africa was eventually lost to Arab conquest in the 7th century. Speaking of the Arab conquests, this is a crucial point. When Islamic armies swept out of Arabia in the 630s and 640s, both the Byzantine and Persian empires were shadows of their former selves. Centuries of plague had sapped their strength, depleted their manpower, damaged their economies. Both empires had also been locked in a devastating war with each other from 602 to 628, which further exhausted them. But they only fought that war so desperately, partly because they were already weakened and desperate. The plague created the conditions for everything that followed. Imagine Byzantine officials in Syria or Egypt trying to organize defense against Arab invaders. You need to recruit soldiers, but the plague has killed so many young men. You need to raise taxes to pay troops, but the tax base has collapsed. You need local populations to support the war effort, but they're demoralized after generations of plague, high taxes, and religious disputes. Many local populations actually welcomed the Arab conquerors as liberators from Byzantine taxation. There were social changes too. The plague disrupted family structures. Inheritance laws became chaotic when entire families died. Orphans were everywhere. The church became more important as it provided charity and social services that the weakened state could no longer offer. Some historians argue the plague contributed to the rise of feudalism. With labor scarce, workers gained bargaining power, but this was countered by lords trying to bind peasants to the land. The details varied by region, but there was definitely a shift toward more coercive labor relationships in some areas. Trade routes shifted. Some ports that were devastated never fully recovered. New commercial centers emerged. The balance of power in the Mediterranean began shifting. There's also some evidence of climate impact. With massive agricultural abandonment, forests regrew in some areas. This might have affected local climates and even carbon cycles, though this is speculative. One thing worth noting, while the plague was catastrophic, it didn't destroy civilization. The Byzantine Empire survived for another 900 years. Cities rebuilt, trade eventually recovered, though never to quite the same level. The plague was a massive shock, but it was a shock to a resilient, complex civilization that adapted and continued. Still, the world after the plague of Justinian was fundamentally different from the world before it. The ancient Mediterranean economy, that integrated system of trade and tribute that had existed for centuries, was permanently broken. The stage was set for the medieval world. When people don't understand what's killing them, they look for meaning in suffering. The plague of Justinian arrived in a deeply religious age, and people naturally interpreted it through theological lenses. Many Christians saw the plague as divine punishment. After all, the Bible was full of examples of God sending plagues to punish sin. The plagues of Egypt, the plague that struck Israel for David's census. Church leaders preached repentance. If plague was punishment, then the solution was to return to righteousness. But this created a theological problem. If plague was punishment for sin, why did it strike the righteous and wicked alike? Procopius himself notes that the plague seemed random. It killed monks and sinners, rich and poor, old and young. This randomness was deeply disturbing. Some theologians developed sophisticated arguments. Perhaps the righteous who died were being called home to God as a mercy, spared from witnessing worse horrors to come. Perhaps the plague was a test of faith, like the trials of Job. Perhaps it was a mystery beyond human understanding, and faith required accepting divine will without comprehension. Other Christians saw apocalyptic significance. There was a strong belief in the 6th century that the world was entering its final age. The plague seemed like one of the signs of the end times described in Revelation. Some texts from this period have a distinctly apocalyptic tone. This isn't just a disease, it's the beginning of the end of the world. Emperor Justinian himself became more religiously focused after surviving the plague. He had always been devout, but his later religious policies became more stringent. He cracked down harder on pagans and heretics. Some historians see this as plague-related trauma expressing itself in increased religious zeal. There were also local variations. Some regions saw a surge in the cult of saints, particularly plague saints like Saint Sebastian, who were believed to offer protection. Churches were built or rededicated. Relics became more important as people sought supernatural protection. Now, what about actual medical responses? Roman medicine in this period was sophisticated by ancient standards, but still based on fundamentally wrong theories. As I mentioned earlier, the dominant theory was humorism. Disease came from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors treated plague patients by trying to rebalance their humors. This meant bloodletting, purges, specific diets, and various herbal remedies. None of this worked against plague bacteria, but nobody knew that. Some treatments might have actually helped with symptoms. Poultices might have eased the pain of buboes. Fever-reducing herbs might have provided comfort, but nothing could stop the bacterial infection itself. There were also folk remedies. People tried everything, wearing amulets, carrying aromatic herbs, drinking special potions, using prayers and incantations. The desperation was real. People would try anything that offered even a glimmer of hope. Interestingly, some people did notice that the disease seemed to spread through contact. We have accounts of people isolating themselves or fleeing to the countryside to avoid infection. This shows a kind of practical epidemiological thinking, even without understanding the mechanism. But systematic quarantine wasn't really possible. Cities needed food from the countryside. Trade couldn't stop completely. People had families they couldn't abandon, and the role of rats and fleas wasn't understood. So even perfect isolation of humans wouldn't necessarily work if rats were present. There's a tragic irony here. The plague was preventable with knowledge they didn't have. If they'd understood about rat-borne disease and implemented aggressive rat control, they might have stopped it. If they had antibiotics, they could have treated it, but they had neither the knowledge nor the tools. Instead, they had prayer, resignation, and the human capacity to endure suffering. Many contemporary accounts emphasize how people maintained their humanity in the face of catastrophe, caring for the sick at even personal risk, ensuring proper burials when possible, maintaining social bonds even as the world fell apart. The plague didn't destroy human dignity or compassion, but it certainly tested both. For over 1,000 years, the true cause of the plague of Justinian remained unknown. Historical sources described the symptoms but couldn't identify the pathogen. Then came modern science, and specifically the field of ancient DNA analysis. The breakthrough came in 2013. A team led by geneticist Hendrik Poinar at McMaster University in Canada extracted DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in a 6th century graveyard in Bavaria. Teeth are perfect for this. The pulp cavity preserves DNA better than most tissues. What they found was revolutionary. DNA from Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague. But not just any plague. This was a previously unknown strain, now called the Justinianic plague strain. This was huge for several reasons. First, it definitively proved that the plague of Justinian was indeed bubonic plague, settling a debate that had raged among historians. Some scholars had speculated it might be smallpox, typhus, or even hemorrhagic fever. Now we knew for certain. Second, by sequencing the ancient plague genome and comparing it to modern plague strains, scientists could trace the evolutionary history of the bacterium. And what they found was surprising. The Justinianic plague strain was not the direct ancestor of the strain that caused the Black Death in the 14th century. Instead, it was a separate lineage that apparently died out. This means the Black Death wasn't a recurrence of the plague of Justinian, it was a completely independent emergence of plague in humans. This suggests that plague has jumped from its animal reservoirs to humans multiple times throughout history. The Justinianic plague was one pandemic, the Black Death was another, and there have been others, including modern outbreaks. By analyzing the DNA, scientists could also trace where the Justinianic strain originated. The genetic evidence points to Central or East Africa as the source, probably in rodent populations in the highlands. From there, it spread along trade routes. The DNA also tells us about the bacterium itself. It had genes for virulence factors, the proteins that help it evade the immune system and spread through the body. It was fully capable of causing the devastating disease described in historical sources. More recent studies have extracted plague DNA from sites across Europe and the Mediterranean, building up a genetic map of how the disease spread. Different burial sites have slightly different variants, allowing scientists to track the paths of transmission. This is the power of ancient DNA. It turns historical mysteries into answerable scientific questions. We're not just guessing based on symptom descriptions anymore. We have the actual pathogen's genome. But the scientific investigation hasn't settled all debates. In fact, it's raised new questions, particularly about the plague's historical impact. Some historians, like Lee Mordecai and his colleagues, have argued that the impact of the plague of Justinian has been overstated. They point out that documentary evidence for massive population decline is limited to certain urban centers. Many rural areas might not have been as severely affected. They also note that the archaeological evidence is mixed. Yes, some cities show clear signs of decline after 540, but others don't. Trade didn't completely collapse, it shifted. Some regions actually seem to have prospered in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Their argument is that historians have fallen into a trap of assuming that just because the plague was deadly in Constantinople, it must have been equally deadly everywhere. But pandemics don't affect all regions equally. Geography, population density, climate, and luck all play roles. On the other side, historians like Kyle Harper argue that the cumulative effect of 2 centuries of recurring plague, even if individual outbreaks varied in severity, would have been devastating. Even if each wave only killed 10 to 20% of the population, repeated waves would hollow out society. Kyle Harper also brings in paleoclimate data. The 6th century saw a period of unusual cold and climate instability, possibly triggered by volcanic eruptions. This would have stressed agricultural systems, making populations more vulnerable to disease. The plague didn't happen in isolation, it was part of a broader crisis. This is an ongoing scholarly debate, and it shows how ancient DNA, while incredibly valuable, doesn't answer every question. It tells us what the disease was and where it came from, but the question of how much it altered history requires looking at many types of evidence: archaeological, historical, paleoclimatic, and synthesizing them. What we can say with confidence is this: the plague of Justinian was a major pandemic caused by bubonic plague. It killed millions of people over 2 centuries. It disrupted the Byzantine economy and contributed to the empire's decline. And it was one of several catastrophic plague pandemics in human history. So, what can we learn from the plague of Justinian? First, pandemics are not new, and they've been shaping history for as long as humans have lived in dense populations connected by trade. The Justinianic Plague, the Black Death, the 1918 flu, COVID-19, these are all part of a larger pattern of emerging infectious diseases that periodically devastate human populations. Second, disease ecology matters. Plague persists in animal reservoirs and periodically spills over into humans when conditions are right. Understanding these ecological dynamics is crucial for prevention. Modern plague control focuses heavily on monitoring rodent populations and flea vectors, knowledge that would have been invaluable in the 6th century. Third, pandemics don't just kill people, they transform societies. The plague of Justinian contributed to the end of ancient Mediterranean unity and the emergence of the medieval world. It weakened empires, shifted trade routes, changed labor relations, and influenced religious developments. Pandemics are not just medical events, they're historical events with far-reaching consequences. Fourth, human responses to pandemics follow patterns. We see in the 6th century the same things we see in modern pandemics: denial, fear, scapegoating, religious interpretation, folk remedies alongside scientific attempts at treatment, economic disruption, and ultimately resilience and adaptation. And fifth, scientific tools like ancient DNA analysis can solve historical mysteries. We now know more about the plague of Justinian than scholars did even 20 years ago, not because new historical documents were discovered, but because we developed new scientific methods. The legacy of the plague of Justinian lives on. It's in the DNA database of plague evolution. It's in the historical trajectory that led from the ancient to the medieval world. It's in the mass graves scattered across 3 continents. And it's in the reminder that we are not immune to the forces that shaped our ancestors' lives. Plague still exists today. There are about 1,000 to 2,000 cases annually worldwide, mostly in Africa, Asia, and even the western United States. But we have antibiotics now. If caught early, plague is usually survivable with drugs like streptomycin or doxycycline. What was a death sentence in 542 is now usually survivable. But antibiotic-resistant plague is a concern. Yersinia pestis can acquire resistance genes. If a highly resistant strain emerged and spread, we could face challenges our ancestors would find grimly familiar. The plague of Justinian was a catastrophe that killed tens of millions, shattered economies, toppled empires, and reshaped history. For 2 centuries, it was one of the dominant forces in the Mediterranean world, a microscopic bacterium that wielded more power than any emperor. It reminds us that history is not just made by great leaders, battles, and ideas. It's also made by climate, ecology, disease, forces that often operate beyond human control, but which we must understand and respond to. And it reminds us that the past is not as distant as we might think. The same bacterium that devastated Constantinople still exists in the world today. The same ecological dynamics that launched that pandemic could launch another. The plague of Justinian is history, but the lessons it teaches are timeless. Thanks for listening to Life Science Channel. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. And let me know in the comments what historical pandemic should I cover next. Until next time, stay curious, stay healthy, and remember, we're all part of a much longer story.